Each week, we present and discuss topics that touch on geopolitical, cultural, economic, human rights, and more, and how they may affect you, our global listeners. 2, we enhance discussions with featured guests or experts in their field. We discuss by way of reference any and all nationalities, ethnicities, and races from Americans to Russians, Koreans, Mexicans, Israelis, Palestinians, and others, blacks, whites, and others alike. We also touch on religions, including Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, and others. But as I've said many times on this program, discussions will always be constructive and informative and will never be intentionally or maliciously demeaning or degrading to any single race, religion, or nationality. We're in the business of informing, enlightening, and stimulating thought for constructive action, and we're not in the business of insulting. And so, as I used to tell my students, if it seems we haven't gotten around to talking about you, your nationality, religion, or other affiliation, don't be offended or complain. Give us time. We'll get around to you. Now, last week, we launched the first of a series of programs to examine the political and humanitarian crisis between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. Could it have been prevented, and is there a solution? We had as our guest Dr. Thomas Arfedizin, former NATO strategist, professor emeritus of national security affairs, and former chairman of the Europe-Russia Studies Group at the U.S. Naval War College. Well, tonight, in a continuation of that discussion, we're going to be hosting Mr. Bob McConnell of the Washington, D.C.-based U.S. Ukraine Foundation, where we'll be exploring more of the human cost of this crisis. You too can join the conversation on Voice It Radio's Facebook page or calling 1-216-772-0500. Also, email your questions to goingglobalvoice@gmail.com. That is goingglobalvoice@gmail.com. You can also tweet me at global_Delgado. That is at global_Delgado. Let me set the stage for tonight's discussion. Sadly, as we all know, Russia invaded the sovereign country of Ukraine on February 24th by announcing a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine and protect Russian Jews living in Ukraine. He launched an all-out invasion of the country, ruthlessly attacking major cities, occupying and reducing major infrastructure to rubble, even resorting to attacking civilian populations, civilian targets, including hospitals, apartment complexes, and railway stations, teeming with civilians seeking nothing but a means to escape. Hundreds of Ukrainian civilians have perished at the indiscriminate violence perpetrated on them by the Russians, including now a pregnant woman who was injured in last week's well-documented attack on a maternity hospital. Reports are that she died from her injuries over the weekend. New reports are now coming in of Russian troops not only killing civilians, but also looting stores, private homes in occupied areas. Now, this is very reminiscent of Russian troops' behavior in World War II when they entered Germany and other occupied areas that became the Soviet bloc countries. They raped, pillaged, and plundered by many, many reports. Now, too, Putin has threatened nuclear war, saying that he would attack any country interfering with Russia with, quote, devastation they have never seen before, including attacking any country seeking to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Well, since the invasion began, approaching 2 weeks now, the Ukrainian military has put up valiant and heroic efforts. President Volodymyr Zelensky has heroically remained in Ukraine despite the threat of assassination by Russian special forces, motivating his people to resist by whatever means necessary. But let's back up a bit. This isn't the first time Russia has brutally attacked Ukraine. February 2014, Russia seized the Crimea region of Ukraine and subsequently annexed it into Russia in what Russian President Vladimir Putin justified as necessary because, and I quote again, the Russian-speaking population in Crimea was threatened and that the threats were absolutely specific and credible, end quote. What he was really referring to was the ouster of then pro-Russian Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. He then again used the same language in speaking about southern and eastern Ukraine. And Putin said, and I quote again, the essential issue is how to ensure the legitimate rights and interests of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in southeast Ukraine, end quote. Really? He's used similar language when attacking Chechnya and Georgia, but both also former Soviet states. Let's fast forward to March 2021. In the continuation of the Russo-Ukraine War of 2014, Russia began assembling military forces along the Russia-Ukraine border and began espousing Russian irredentist views, meaning claims to parts of the former Russian Empire and the former Soviet Union, specifically for Russia, essentially seeking to unify Russians outside of Russian borders into the Russian state. February 21st, 2022, Putin recognized the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, two self-proclaimed states controlled by pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass region. And then the invasion of February 24th. Well, since the invasion began, Russia has faced stiff resistance from the Ukrainian military. Victory was expected in a few short days, but here we are approaching 3 weeks and victory still has been denied Russia. Reports have been received that Russian military is in many instances bogging down. There have been reported shortages of supplies necessary to continue the war. There have also been reports of Russian military deserters, further indicating that the war may not be going to plan. As significantly, Putin himself has become a pariah, certainly with the international community, as Russian citizens began to feel the sting of international sanctions, major credit card companies freezing transactions in Russia, major international companies suspending or withdrawing operations from Russian banking institutions, even freezing money transfer operations, and more. Some real questions remain. Why did Putin launch this invasion to begin with? Is it because he felt that the West, and specifically the US and NATO, lied to Russia when it was implied that NATO would not encroach on Russian territory, as we discussed last week? What's Putin's endgame in Ukraine with its citizens? Has Putin become a war criminal by attacking and killing innocent civilians? I would posture he has. What is Putin's endgame with the former Soviet bloc countries? Is he seeking a resurgence of the Soviet Union by seizing former Soviet bloc countries? Is Putin a power-hungry madman bent on European conquest, or is he a leader following the basic principle followed by all powers, and that is that nation states are always sensitive to potential threats near their home territory, and that is the doctrine of right to protect, or R2P, in this case, protecting against a rapidly westernizing Ukraine, as some realists would argue. Let's continue our discussion on these and related matters with tonight's guests. You too can join the conversation on Voice It Radio's Facebook page, calling 1-216-772-0500. That's 1-216-772-0500, or email your questions to goingglobalvoice@gmail.com. That's goingglobalvoice@gmail.com. You can also tweet me at global_Delgado. So let's turn to tonight's guest. Bob McConnell and his wife have been active in issues relating to Ukraine since the 1970s. He's a co-founder of the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, which has the longest running American presence in the Ukraine, predating Ukraine's independence. Bob served as a presidential appointee in the Department of Justice throughout President Ronald Reagan's first term. After leaving the administration, Bob was vice president, Washington, D.C. for CBS, and subsequently joined the international law firm Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Bob was embedded in the United States acknowledgement of Ukraine's 1988 Millennium of Christianity, as well as numerous activities supporting both Ukraine's independence in 1991 and the United States extending diplomatic recognition to Ukraine shortly thereafter. Since independence, the U.S. Ukraine Foundation has designed and run numerous programs all across Ukraine designed to build and strengthen civil society and democratic institutions. The foundation recently created the Friends of Ukraine Foundation, which is a nonprofit coalition of experts on Ukraine, including former U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine, two former Supreme Allied Commanders of Europe, former U.S. Army Commander Europe, former NATO officials, energy and economic experts, and more, who come together to make, publish, and advocate for recommendations for U.S. assistance to Ukraine. Bob, that's quite a resume. Welcome to the program, Going Global with David Delgado.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. And yes, we're doing this via Zoom. I can see you. I know you can see me. So again, welcome to the program. Certainly glad to have you on. Bob, tell us about the U.S. Ukraine Foundation a little bit more, and so we can flesh it out.
Well, we set up the U.S. Ukraine Foundation. There were four of us, Nadia, my wife, and I. Really, what prompted it goes back a little bit before the establishment of the foundation. In 1989, the movement RUK was established in Ukraine had every ethnic, every religious group and so forth. It didn't advertise itself at its beginnings as an independence movement, but it was a reform movement. It wanted things differently. We were kind of interested in what that was and what was going on. And in January of 1990, RUC was going to have a Hands Across Ukraine, a personal, lineup of people from Lviv to Kiev. And Nadia wanted to see this, and it was her first trip, and she went to Ukraine for it. Back in those days, you got on the plane and there was no contact until you got back off a plane. But she went, and in the process of being there for the Hands Across Ukraine, she met the leadership of RUC, very impressed by them. We had a conversation with a representative of RUC a few months before that, who had gotten to Washington. He was curious for us because he was in the leadership of RUC. Yevayuski was his name, is his name. He's passed away just recently. Member of RUC, member of the Communist Party, member of the Supreme Rada of the Soviet Union, and here he was, a reformer. And when he was here, among other things, he asked us at a dinner in Washington whether we could do a couple of things. One was, could we get observers to the first contested election in March of 1990? And could we, a number of RUC members were going to get elected to the parliament, and he described it as, we've never led anything, and we don't know anything about the American system of government. Is there any way you could put on a program for us? Not that we want to have the American system, but at least we'd like to know it, given that we've never been told the truth during the Soviet Union. And so she went, met in January, then we both went back for the election along with some other people as observers in March. And at that point, the only way I know how to say this is we were really brought into the inner workings of RUC. The Grand Council meetings where they were planning their future after the election and so forth. Nadia and I sat in on it. We participated in the meetings, got to know them quite well. And we came back and started doing things in Washington, not speaking for RUC, but submitting testimony at hearings about, what we thought was going on and so forth. We shared it. Email back in those days wasn't anything like now. It was a very cumbersome thing. It was thousands of dollars a month, and you typed into your phone. It went to a port in San Francisco, then it went to Moscow, and then people in Ukraine could pick it up if they could get a phone line. But we had our person there, and so we were in regular contact with the leadership of RUC. And it evolved into really the independence movement. So Nadia had the view that, look, Ukraine's going to become independent, going back to your question of how the foundation got started. It's going to become independent, and in her words, the United States is going to see all these new countries that have been republics within the Soviet Union. They're going to give aid, they're going to have programs, and all that money is going to go to what is colloquially called the Beltway Bandits. They're going to be programs designed by bureaucrats in Washington. I want to get some of that money and do what really needs to be done. Well, I set up the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, set up an office in Ukraine, and over the years have gotten various grants, mostly programs that were designed by the foundation, which AID doesn't like. They don't like unsolicited proposals, but we were able to get a number of them. First, to deal with the parliament. The parliament had been a rubber stamp, and members of parliament, both communists and RUC members, wanted ideas on, how do they formulate a real live legislature. And the small little foundation didn't have the wherewithal at that point to deal with all the contracting stuff with the federal government. So we linked up with Indiana University's School of government, and we put on a legislative development program. And it went on for 4 or 5 years. And what happened, you'd get requests from parliamentarians, deputies, how does this happen in the Western countries, in the European countries? And we treated the communists and the RUC members alike and gave them the studies and put together comparative things for them. But at some point, Nadia said, reform is going to have to take place in Kiev, but it's going to take a very long time. We ought to be working at the local level. And I bring this up because this was the largest project. We established a community partnership program that linked 18 mid-sized US cities with 18 mid-sized Ukrainian cities. None of the American cities had significant Ukrainian American populations. I describe it as we turned the very best America has to offer loose on Ukraine, and that was American volunteers. Ukrainian, the language didn't have a word for volunteers until this program. And these various cities set to work, each had work plans and what they wanted to do. This program went on for 10 years, and the work plans were phenomenal and the way that things came together, but I could probably take even longer describing the unintended consequences that went on in these city partnerships. And then in addition, we had 4 work centers across Ukraine where we trained a little over 60,000 local government workers in democratic institution building and so forth. I could go on forever just about that program, but the foundation has done that. Now, in more recent years, an awful lot of the funding for those kind of programs, either whether from the United States government or foundations or European institutions, all of whom contributed to various projects we had, has gotten far more scarce, and other types of programs have set up. So we've been doing other things, but you brought up the Friends of Ukraine network. That we put that together about the time of Putin's invasion of Crimea. Like you said, it's got former ambassadors to Ukraine, but a lot of independent experts on Ukraine, military, economic, energy, and so forth. And they're at universities, they're in think tanks and so forth, but we bring them together as the Friend of Ukraine network in different task forces, and have since 2014 come up with annual recommendations for US assistance to Ukraine. Those recommendations are usually tied to Congress's appropriation and authorization process. And once we publish the recommendations, then we go to the Hill, we have various conferences with committee chairmen and staffers and others, explaining the recommendations, answering questions, and promoting them. We do that in the executive as well. It's been quite an experience to have all these people, General Wesley Clark, General Phil Breedlove, General Ben Hodges, Ed Chow on energy, Anders Osman in economic matters, former ambassadors Herbst and Taylor and Sandy Birchbaum, who was ambassador to Russia and number 2 at NATO for a while.
We're going to be taking a quick break, Bob, but before we do, I do want to ask you a question. You mentioned that there is no word for volunteers, or was before. There was no word for volunteers except for this program now. Is that the case in the Russian language? I was not aware of that. Was there not a word for volunteers in Russian?
I don't know the answer to that. I was told by Ukrainians that there hadn't been one in Ukrainian, but I don't know about Russia.
Oh, obviously, a very interesting concept or situation that there would not be a word for volunteer in Ukrainian, probably not in Russian, but obviously I'm not informed on that. But nonetheless, interesting that there wasn't a word in Ukraine, and that speaks to the context of the particular country with whom we're dealing, and that is on the Russian side. We're going to be taking a quick break, Bob. I want to come back and discuss more specifically about the crisis and how the U.S. Ukraine Foundation can assist in that manner. We're talking to Bob McConnell of the Washington, D.C. based U.S. Ukraine Foundation. We'll be exploring more when we return right after this break. I do want to say that this program is brought to you by the Adams Board of Cuyahoga County and Margaret Wong Associates, Cleveland-based award-winning immigration attorneys, helping individuals and companies on immigration issues in the United States and other. You can reach them at imwong.com. That is imwong.com. Again, we're taking a short break. We'll be right back.
We are Voice It Radio, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on voiceitradio.com.
Hello, this is Larry H. Gardner, host of Headlines and Headaches on voiceitradio.com. Fentanyl is the leading cause of drug overdose.
Your weekly Eastern Neighborhood wrap-up show here on Voice It Radio from 2 to 3 p.m. every Friday. Tune in.
Hi, this is Queen Elder Jacqueline Swells Goodrum. Tune in to Daughters of the Nile every Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. at voiceitradio.com.
What's up, everybody? This your boy, Amir, a.k.a. A-Rap Money.
It's your favorite friend, Brandalis.
You already know who this is. It's Harley Girl.
Hey, we want you guys to tune in each and every Wednesday night, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to check out Unpopular Opinion.
We're going to be giving our unpopular opinions about everything that's trending locally, nationally, and around the world.
We'll also have special guests, controversial topics, and as always, we'll be live streaming, so please don't forget to call in.
So don't forget to tune in to Unpopular Opinion every Wednesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on voiceitradio.com.
Hey, this is Eric Dean Seaton, television director and creator of the graphic novel series Legend of the Mantamaji. Whether I'm in Cleveland or Cali or on Raven's Home or Life in Pieces, I'm always tuned into voiceitradio.com.
Hey, this is your girl, Laura Cowan of Laura Cowan's Empowerment Hour. Check me out every Monday night from 6 to 7 p.m. live right here on voiceitradio.com.
What's going on? This is your brother Bashir Jones, and you are tuned in to voiceitradio.com.
Join yours truly, Harvey Zay, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. We will talk jazz, have interviews with special guests, and spin some of the greatest jazz tunes from past and present. It's Harvey Zay's Jazz Room from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on voiceitradio.com.
We are Voice It Radio, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on voiceitradio.com.
Welcome back to Going Global with David Delgado. We're talking to Mr. Bob McConnell of the Washington, D.C. based U.S. Ukraine Foundation, and we're discussing part 2 of a program we began last week, and that is a political and humanitarian crisis between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. Could it have been prevented, and is there a peaceful solution? You too can join the conversation or the program with questions by viewing Voice at Radio's Facebook page, calling 1-216-772-0500, or email your questions to goingglobalvoice@gmail.com. That's goingglobalvoice@gmail.com. You can also tweet me at global_Delgado. Tonight's program is brought to you by Margaret Wong and Associates, Cleveland-based award-winning immigration attorneys helping individuals with companies on immigration issues in the United States and other. You can reach them at imwong.com. That's imwong.com. So, Bob, getting on with the crisis, the current situation at hand, what prompted the current crisis, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's very personal. It's prompted by a leader in Russia who does not know any history, has a very confirmed in his own mind view of history that is absolutely wrong. And based on his history and understanding of history, believes that Ukraine is not a country. Ukrainians are really Russians. It goes on not just with Ukraine, but Ukraine is his top target at the moment. And he believes in his own mind that Ukraine is part of Russia, and he's got to bring it back. And wants to establish not the former Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. I mean, and that's seen in so many ways. I mean, his speeches, whatever it was in 2017 in Munich, he just doesn't believe any of what is the post Cold War structure represents the world as he thinks it belongs. And so therefore he wants to take back Ukraine. He started with his little green men and denying that he had anybody in Crimea until he annexed it. And then I know people make reference to the separatists in Donbass. Well, yeah, there are a few separatists, but they're run, they're managed, they're equipped, and they're commanded by Russian regulars. It's all been a figment of his imagination. I mean, this latest invasion, or it's not latest, but this extended invasion that started, this soldiers are being captured and saying, we thought we were going on a training mission. Others in the East have been captured and realizing, look at what they're being taken prisoner by Ukrainians and saying, we thought we were here to shoot at Americans. I mean, he's lied and he's controlled so much of the media. Obviously, other voices get in. That's why there's demonstrations all across Russia. But by and large, he dominates the Russian mentality and understanding of what's going on. And clearly, he thought, well, let me put it this way. When he had 150,000 troops lined up across several dimensions of Ukrainian borders, the common thing in the press was that he was ready to he could launch a major invasion. The generals who are part of the Friends of Ukraine network said he doesn't have the manpower for a major invasion. And when he started, I thought maybe they were wrong. Well, no, they've been proved to be correct. You can't take a country the size of Ukraine with 150,000 troops. He thought and he believed that he could roll into the country and his forces were going to be seen as liberators. So the kids that were told they were on training missions wouldn't have any particular resistance. Well, he didn't realize that Ukrainians won, the people of Ukraine, whether they're Ukrainian background, Russian background, or whatever other background, the people of Ukraine in 1991, when they were gearing up to have their referendum for independence, the Western media, why don't I just say it? The Western elite said, oh no, this will lead to bloodshed. There will be civil war. And even some were saying nuclear chaos. Well, what happened? They had a referendum and 92% of the people of Ukraine voted for independence. It was peaceful. And those people who elected to have an independent Ukraine and did so peacefully, those people and their children either lived under or their parents lived under and have spread that information under the Soviet regime, where there was no religious freedom, where there was the gulag, where there were shortages, where there was oppression, where there were no cars on the street, well, a few ladas here and there. I
want to say that there were only 4 types of cars on the street: the green Lada, the blue Lada, the red Lada, and the black Lada.
That's about right. That's about right.
And I've been to the Ukraine, but obviously not as many times, not as often as you have. But please continue.
Well, and so over 30 years, the people of Ukraine have experienced independence, freedom. They've been struggling to get the country they wanted, but they've had freedom. They've been able to travel. They've been able to go to their churches. Their churches were reopened and so forth. Now, because of Putin's narrow-minded, selfish ignorance, he has started a war, and the people of Ukraine are now fighting their war of independence, the one they didn't have to fight in 1991.
All right, let's put ourselves in Putin's mind for just a minute, if you will. The collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin finds himself in East Germany. Literally, the Soviet Union is collapsing around him. The wall is collapsing around him. He is in East Germany. He calls his superiors for direction of some sort, and none was coming. There were no border guards that were shooting civilians who were tearing down the wall. Putin finds himself powerless. He returns to Russia, becomes a part of the establishment, becomes, I suppose, mayor of St. Petersburg, and then he joins Yeltsin's government. And all the while, he's apparently seething. Now, this isn't only my opinion. This is the opinion of experts that I've discussed this matter with in the past. He's seething with resentment. He's seething with anger because the Soviet Union collapsed around him, and he was powerless to do anything. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, ostensibly, Mikhail Gorbachev received assurances from then President Reagan, subsequently from George H.W. Bush, and then presidents post that up until pretty much Bill Clinton, where the NATO countries or the NATO bloc would not seek to expand NATO to encroach on Russian territory. They essentially gave them assurances in this regard, and yet NATO did encroach on their territory. NATO annexed a number of different countries: Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, just to name a few, the Czech Republic, just to name a few, and slowly began to encroach on their territory. There's a postulate called the Russian postulates, foreign postulates 2012 to 2018 on Russian foreign policy that was published by the Russian International Affairs Council. And we're going to have them as a guest next week, where it essentially said that, and I'm paraphrasing, that Russia is not going to tolerate encroachment on its territories. It's going to surround itself with former Eastern Bloc countries. So you put all of that into context and you're thinking, did Putin feel threatened, and does he feel threatened because NATO countries are encroaching on Russian territory? What would the United States do under similar circumstances if the CST and the Shanghai Cooperative Agreement were to seek to annex either Canada, Mexico, or even Caribbean countries? Certainly not invade. But once again, I think it's important to get into this character's mind to try to figure out where he was coming from, what happened, and if this is the case, were NATO members and the United States specifically not listening to what he was saying for all these years, that he was not going to tolerate encroachment of NATO countries into the under the sovereign, should I say, encroach on Russia's sovereign borders?
Well, first of all, I've heard from every one of those administrations that no such assurances were ever given, period. That's a figment of Putin's imagination and interpretations of conversations that did not say that. Second of all, NATO did not go out and annex Latvia, Lithuania, whatever. those countries asked to become part of NATO. It was their choice, and they asked, and they met certain requirements and were included. I also note that when the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia was offered the opportunity to be in NATO and rejected it out of hand. As far as encroaching on Russian territory, I mean, that's an egomaniacal thought that Putin thinks Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, those are Russian territory. No, they're independent countries, period, full stop. Those people have a right to their independence and their state of view and where they want to go. And it's none of his damn business. Was he ever threatened? No, but none of those countries have threatened him. The only invasions that have taken place during all this time have been by Russia. They're the ones interfering. You know, there's 4 ways really to carry on a war, and he does all 4. Diplomatic, and he uses that quite well. Information, call that propaganda. He uses that in all across the world. Absolute blatant lies that work their way into understandings of people across the globe. Military, he uses that, and economic, including economic cyber. He's attacking the United States. He's done it. He's attacked every European country, and he's done it. He's conducting a war with Ukraine, the United States, and the West. It's just that the military battlefield right now is Ukraine.
So let me just interrupt you there for a second. You're right. The military battlefield is Ukraine. You're absolutely right. NATO did not solicit these countries for membership. These countries did come to NATO. And as you said, meeting certain requirements, they were voted in. Ukraine was not voted in. Ukraine was seeking NATO membership as well as EU membership. Having said that, the question becomes, and to your other point, Russia was offered NATO membership, but they declined. Instead, they were given, and they joined what's called the Partnership for Peace program in 1994, as well as the Russia-NATO Council in 2002. So there was a little bit of a honeymoon period there between NATO and Russia, which I feel was squandered. Now, you're absolutely right. A country does have the right to its own security, much like Russia does. So does Ukraine. So do these other countries that join NATO. But you can't help but wonder: could an alternative been negotiated that would have assured peace throughout the region? These countries are coming to NATO for a reason. They feel threatened. They feel they don't trust Russia. But could an alternative have been negotiated to where the countries are not granted NATO status, but yet there is a guarantee of peace? Russia will not encroach on these countries' territories, will not invade these countries, but engage them economically and not militarily. And to that extent, the status quo is maintained. And of course, we're never going to know that because that wasn't the case. NATO allowed these countries to join because they did feel threatened. But one has to wonder if alternative solutions.
I think we do know. 1994, Budapest Memorandum. United States, Great Britain, and Russia and Ukraine entered into an agreement whereby Ukraine, who didn't want to give up. Now, there's a lot of details of this. The nuclear weapons that were on the Ukrainian soil were under the control of the Kremlin, but they were in Ukraine. And Britain, the United States, and Russia wanted them to be removed and taken to Russia. Ukraine was willing to get rid of them, but for several years argued about giving them to Russia. They didn't want to give them to Russia. But in the Budapest Memorandum, they agreed that they would be transported to Russia. In return, there was going to be some nuclear fusion stuff for the Ukrainian power stations. But the key to that was that the 3 countries gave assurances to Ukraine for the sovereignty of its country and its borders. Now, that's the kind of talk you were talking about. Could we have an agreement where everybody agreed to get along, blah, blah, blah? Well, how well did that answer? Russia violated it starting in Crimea. We violated it because we haven't done it, didn't do anything about that. So, I mean, an agreement like that with Russia was meaningless. I mean, you might have been able to have them, but they weren't going to mean anything because Putin believes all of those people are Russians and that's all part of Russia. He has that unique, I mean, really strange psychic of Russian speakers. He has to defend Russian speakers because they're Russians. There's an awful lot of people in the world that speak English and they're not either British or American. But he thinks if you speak Russian, he's got to come in and protect you from whatever it is that he thinks you're being threatened by.
You know, no doubt that Putin is not to be trusted, and one has to wonder if the Russians and Putin specifically, but the Russians post World War II did not learn from the Germans in what was called Operation Barbarossa, where the Germans were planning to invade Germany, all the while signing an agreement with them. And the three lessons learned from Operation Barbarossa were sign an agreement with your enemy, then continue to develop technology, continue to develop weapons, continue to progress toward war, and then launch an invasion. Three lessons that the Russians seem to have learned. So very quick, well, not very quickly, actually, let's just turn to what's happening on the ground now. What do you know, what do you hear is happening on the ground in Ukraine as we speak?
Well, there's a lot of things. I mean, first of all, we're all appalled by the slaughter, the attacking of civilians and so forth. But if I can step back from that for a minute, what our military leaders had been telling us for a number of years was that the Ukrainian military, that was not much of anything when Ukraine became independent and was starved, if you will, under the Yanukovych regime, but subsequently had become a very legitimate fighting force. Our generals and people say, look, we've given them some weapons. And they know how to use the weapons, but they're using them in ways we didn't even know they could be used. We've learned from the Ukrainians. And I mean, just the other day in a conversation, General Hodges said to me, you know, this is one heck of a fighting force. It's probably the best fighting force in Europe. And they're fighting for their freedom with emotion. What are the Russians? We're learning the Russians. I mean, whatever Putin thought, he may have nukes, but he doesn't have a very good military. I mean, bogged down, lack of supplies, deserters, stuck in mud. I mean, they may be able to shell the heck out of people and kill people and fire artillery, but, you know, Ukrainians are taking out tank columns. Columns are groupings of people, military. What are you doing all grouped together? I mean, this is an incompetent military. 3 generals and 4,000 killed soldiers. I mean, here you have Putin hat in hand going and trying to get Syrians and Chinese to come help him fight a war that he thought was going to be a roll into Kiev and take out Zelensky and set up a puppet government. I mean, they're not much of a fighting force. We keep bowing to his threats of nuclear, but I mean, he keeps escalating things and we don't.
What, in your opinion, is the perception that Russians, the Russian populace in general, have toward Ukrainians? Is it positive? Do they see them as brethren, or do they see them as citizens of a sovereign country or rebels?
Well, I think there's a mix. I mean, you have an awful lot of Russians who are being arrested because they're demonstrating against the war. They don't want to fight. There are soldiers that are giving up in Ukraine and saying, I don't have any beef with you people. So I think there is a mix, and a lot of that mix is on the bad side. I would have to say, in my view, from everything I've read and been told, the domination of the state media and its constant lies about what's going on, and Ukraine's governed by fascists and all that foolishness. But I think in the bottom line is, by and large, they don't have a beef. I mean, what was it? It was right before the latest extension of the invasion. The Retired Russian Military Officers Association, an official organization in Russia, had a press conference and had a document calling for there to be no war. Ukraine is no threat. We have no fight with Ukraine. Don't go. And the head of the association who had the press conference, and I can't pronounce his name, but the general, who I didn't know when he gave it and did it at a press conference, our generals told us that wasn't just a retired Russian general. He was one of the biggest hardliners in the Russian military up until a few years before. And he's there telling Putin, there's nobody's threatening us. We shouldn't be going to war.
So where are these generals now? Where are these people now that are saying we should not be going to war? Putin seems to be calling the shots unilaterally and not bilaterally or multilaterally. He seems to be calling the shots. Where's the Duma?
Oh, the Duma's got, the Duma is dangerous in many respects, at least the majority, as Putin is. They pass everything he wants.
Right. And I'm sorry, but I'm getting back to that question that I asked. They do. You're absolutely right. They pass anything he wants. So does everybody else. Why?
Well, it's a repressive state. I mean, we had, I don't know if you know who he is, Paul Goebel and David Kramer, both experts on what's going on inside of Russia, the Russian Federation. And I mean, the comments were that that program that we had was repression in Russia and aggression in Ukraine. How are they linked? But the thing that came out about Russia is that the repression in Russia is now gotten back to the levels that hadn't seen since the darkest days of the Soviet Union. I mean, people are being repressed. Things are being shut off. I mean, we read every day now they're shutting off various things and access to things, people being arrested for demonstrations. But interestingly, the people seem to keep coming back, whether the repressed and arrested or not.
Well, here's the feedback that I've caught on that. To your point, the feedback that I've caught on that is Putin literally interviews his ostensible allies and says, "Do you want to continue with the lifestyle that you have? Yes or no?" And if the answer is yes, then you're on my team. If the answer is no, you disappear. Disappear figuratively or literally, you disappear. And he's done that one by one by one to rein them in.
Oh, I've heard the same thing, and it's interesting. The comparison of President Zelensky, you get the pictures of him, having a meal with the soldiers on the front line, and every picture you have of Putin, he's sitting at the end of a 50-yard line table, and nobody's anywhere near him. I mean, I think his paranoia goes beyond worrying about what's going on in Ukraine and NATO. I think it's some paranoia about what could be going on in the Kremlin itself. This went on at the end of the World War II with Hitler. I mean, he was getting more isolated, and everything I understand, Putin is more and more and more isolated, but he is calling the shots. But for how long, I don't know.
But he's more and more isolated. Does that not make him more dangerous? He's got his back against the wall. He is not winning this war. He's losing the war. As a matter of fact, he's actually achieving what he did not want to have happen, and that is a unified West against him. The West is coalescing against him. China is refusing thus far to assist him. He's got his finger on the nuclear trigger. Doesn't that make him more dangerous?
I think it makes him more dangerous, but I don't know how it's set up in the Kremlin. But I still, the nuclear thing, do I worry about it? It's a risk, yes, but there's all kinds of risk, and there's a risk to letting him go. My own view, and I realize I know there's a lot of people that think it in Washington, but they don't say it. Stopping this war cannot be our objective. Defeating Putin has to be the objective. If we don't defeat him, whether he takes over Ukraine or he takes over part of Ukraine or there's some kind of a settlement for now, he's going to keep pushing. And I don't accept everybody's thing that, well, he won't go across a NATO border. If he's not stopped, why wouldn't he? He's not going to stop until he's stopped. And there are risks, sure there are. But I think letting him go in the long term, or the consequences are going to be greater than defeating him now.
Well, you're echoing my views, and that is that, and the question was going to be, excuse me, is he an expansionist seeking a return of the former USSR? And I got to believe he is.
Yes, yes.
I agree with your point that if he's not stopped, he's going to continue on. He's going to, and Crimea seems to have been a test, and then now Ukraine is a test. And if he's not stopped, however that happens, he's going to continue on with the next NATO country. The next NATO country could be Poland.
Well, he might see Finland first. He's always thought that was part of Russia.
Well, and that's true. And unfortunately, the Finns don't see it that way, and never has. And that also begs the answer to the other question: what is Putin's end game? And obviously, his end game is continuing on, in your opinion as well as my opinion. I'm just paraphrasing, but let me ask you: what is Putin's end game, in your opinion?
I think his end game is to reestablish the borders of the Russian Empire, and if he ever gets that, he probably is going to want to do more. You know, he wants his legacy to reclaim all the land that was ever under the control of Moscow, and that's broader than the USSR.
So we have had some questions emailed in that I need to get to, but we've already gotten to one of them indirectly, and that is, do you think Putin will invade other countries now that he's invaded Ukraine? And obviously the answer to that is yes. Thank you, John, for emailing that question. Also, another question: do you really think Putin would use nuclear weapons against the West? What are your thoughts?
I don't think so. I mean, there are all kinds of nuclear weapons, and there are some with limited capacities and so forth. Frankly, on the nuclear sphere, I'm more concerned about his indiscriminate shelling around a couple of the Ukrainian nuclear power stations. Hit one of those suckers, and we've got something like more than Chernobyl. It's easy to call, even for a madman, to say he's going to use nuclear weapons. It's another thing if his bluff is called to turn around and do that, because if he did anything really seriously, I mean, if he's worried about his legacy is over.
And I would agree with that. And the guest that we had on the program last week, Tom Fedizan from the U.S. Naval War College, echoed the same sentiments. The question that I asked him then was, will Putin ever be in a position to reintegrate into the leadership of, and let me coin a phrase, or should I say paraphrase a phrase, the League of Modern Nations, or is he going to be a pariah? And Tom's answer was, he's going to be a pariah. He'll never be able to reintegrate back into a leadership position with the West or modern states, for that matter. And I would agree with that. I think his days may be numbered. Hopefully our days aren't numbered because of it. I want to ask you one final question, and this paraphrases a question that's been emailed in as well. What can private citizens do to help Ukrainian citizens, or U.S. Ukraine Foundation to help Ukrainian citizens? That's a final question. We're going to have to close pretty soon.
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I would have liked to have gotten to it anyway. And I'm going to start with this. You can go to usukraine.org, and that's our website. We are doing a lot of different things. I mean, I'm the one doing the Friends of Ukraine, the advocacy to our government and so forth, but we have putting together a coalition, long-term coalition for humanitarian assistance. There are a lot of groups doing things. We're trying to put together a coalition. We've already delivered some medical supplies. We are linked up with the American Hospital Association, with March of Dimes and others as partners, and other groups, and our website shows all that. We're lining up, we're about ready. We've had one plane lift, but we're lining up airplanes, and we have Ambassador Cliff Bond, who is the head of U.S. assistance in Ukraine in 2014-15, Ambassador Timuri Yakachishvili. Those two are our co-chairs for this operation, and it's Operation Ukraine Airlift to get supplies. Timuri has the sources in the ministries in Ukraine, getting up to date. What are the needs? Most of it is medical right now. And Cliff is here getting the supplies in. We're setting up. We've got one warehouse that is our control in Baltimore. We're setting up alliances with other people for warehouses where things can be gathered. We're going to need transportation, ground transportation to airports, but it's going to be critical. And I say long term because whatever happens with this war, the humanitarian crisis is going to go on for years. This displacement is going to have an impact on people's lives for a good long time.
Sadly, I agree with you there. And perhaps we can have either Ambassador Barnes on the program or the other person who you mentioned on this program to further discuss efforts that are ongoing. We're going to have to call it a night, Bob. Unfortunately, we can go on and on on this topic. I think you and I are on the same page. What more can we say? But we certainly can go on and on. As I've said many times in the past, I'll say it again tonight. 2014 was the centennial of World War I. 108 years ago, no one thought there would be a war. The war did come by the end of July 1914, triggered by events in Eastern Europe. Well, in retrospect, war came as somewhat of a shock, an enormous shock, almost like the sinking of the Titanic. In the end, it shattered Europe, cost tens of millions of lives, bankrupted countries, and changed forever those who survived the horrors. Well, a century later, our focus is again on Eastern Europe, the site of a terrible regional conflict that threatens to entangle the world's leading powers. In the present circumstances, I've said before, as in 1914, miscalculations, missteps, technical difficulties, misunderstandings, an inflated ego by either and all sides may well result in a war in which there will be no winners, east or west, only losers, but regrettably, with no one left to lament it. I want to thank Bob McConnell, the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, for appearing on tonight's program. Tonight's program has been brought to you by the Adams Board of Cuyahoga County and Margaret Wong and Associates. That's a Cleveland-based award-winning immigration attorneys law firm representing individuals on immigration issues in the United States and others. For more information, go to imwong.com. That's imwong.com. For those of you whose questions I was unable to get to this evening, my apologies and thank you for listening. Lastly, I'd like to thank my producer for tonight's program, Errol Porter, and the rest of the staff here at voiceofradio.com. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Andrei Kortunov, director of the Russian International Affairs Council, based out of Moscow, as our guest, assuming that Andrei is able to do so. And so until next time, be kind and respectful to one another, because after all, we're all we have. This is David Delgado, and we are going global. Good night.